All right, well, I would intro this with something resembling an intro, but I don't know what this is called. I don't even know what this really is, but I know that Shawn Elliott messaged me on Twitter and said, I have some disagreements with you about Resident Evil Revelations 2. You know, the hot topic video game a month and a half after its release. And so I said, fine, Shawn Elliott, I'll talk to you about Resident Evil Revelations 2. Because I only do things for traffic at Taco and in my job, so I thought this was the way to really just do it the BuzzFeed way, was to start talking about Resident Evil Revelations 2 weeks after release.
I don't even know what to say to that, man.
So, to sort of back up, like, okay, so you are now, you just moved to Austin. You are now working over the developers of Dishonored at Arkane, although, you know, we don't know what you're working on, but you're working presumably on a video game that will come out someday.
I also worked on BioShock Infinite at Irrational Games. I was there for about 6 years, and the obvious, the obvious disclaimer is that I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer. This is like everything I say is entirely my own opinion about video games.
And prior to going to Irrational, you were one of me. You were someone like me. I'm still in the press. I'm still doing that thing, but you did that for a pretty long chunk of time as well, right?
Yeah, it's quite a while. It's like 2002 to, what was it, 2008? I mean, it was a fairly long chunk of time. It felt like it, at least.
Yeah, it does. It feels longer the longer you do it. Is sort of how.
Right. I think I've been a developer now much longer than I've been a member of the press. So that's an important milestone for me.
What were you doing prior to getting on the press?
Oh, I was just in school. I went to undergrad and then grad school. I was working in grocery stores and teaching undergrads. And then
how does one go? Because I mean, everyone, you know, one of the things that always comes up when I talk to folks like, well, how did you get into this? And it's weird because there's not like a great path or anything like that, which makes like giving out advice so difficult. But how did you make that sort of jump then from probably being interested in games to like getting paid to play and talk about them?
I don't know, I feel like I've told the story an awful lot, but to the point that I'm like, oh, am I going to like alter this in some way? But yeah, I mean, I spent almost all of grad school talking about games, even though, you know, there was no formal discussion of them, but with, you know, my colleagues and stuff. And at some point, I just figured, I was like, yeah, that's probably a better way to make money than I don't know. I was looking at my friends, like, I mean, it all happened within like 2 months after I got my MFA. And I was looking at like other peers teaching multiple junior college courses at multiple junior colleges in a single day, and grading and responding to hundreds and hundreds of papers every single night, and not being compensated well, not enjoying it at all. And I thought about, you know, I was reading Electronic Gaming Monthly still, and I just started putting some samples together and started sending them their way. And I was lucky, very, very fortunate in that I got an immediate response and ended up going on out for an interview.
So you started at EGM and then went to what was CGW, Computer Gaming World, and then became Games for Windows.
Yeah, right. There's an amazing, like, very brief interval in between there, though, where I was laid off from EGM as they were downsizing. And I found work with a magazine that was published by, God, I forget. It wasn't Future. It was... I don't know, the publishers of GamePro.
Yeah.
And it was called GameStar, and I guess they had like a version of it in Europe that was successful, and they wanted to launch it in conjunction with Best Buy in North America. But then the deal with Best Buy fell through while I was there, and it was funny. There was good people I worked with. One, our managing editor, Sean Malloy, I ended up working with at Computer Gaming World.
Oh, right. Now he's been at Blizzard for a number of years now.
And but that magazine, man, the direction of it was purely like, you got to remember in that era, like Maxim was the startling success, and everyone wanted to imitate it, EGM included. You know, they were trying to move in that direction, but GameStar was like, without shame, going to move even farther in that direction, where there was like, here's a Christmas buyer's guide, and there's just this random model posing with game peripherals and stuff, wearing like Santa type lingerie, you know. and we're not talking like, you know, highly paid models. It was like they put out a local Craigslist ad and got someone from down the street, you know, which, you know, I mean, it's still a beautiful woman, but it's just It was craziness though, and thankfully that thing folded. And the whole time I was there, I never even like set anything up. I never put anything on my desk. I never put anything in the drawers. And so when they told me I was being laid off because the magazine was being closed, I just like I stood up and I walked out, and that was it. I didn't have to take anything. I was like, okay.
Were you there long enough to even collect a paycheck?
Yeah, it was like 3 months. We did a couple issues and then some online content that was hidden behind a paywall that was available only to subscribers. It was stupid, man. It was like extra pictures of the woman who was modeling. Oh,
That sounds
God.
about right. That sounds about right. So you did that. You were at. So then you came back when GFW was still Computer Gaming World,
Yeah.
and you did
Yep. I
that for.
started freelancing. There was like a big period in there when I was freelancing everywhere. Like I can't even remember, but I've got a collection of all the magazines I ever had stuff published in, and so there's probably like 7 other magazines at the time that I would freelance at, and I was most often freelancing for CGW, and then Jeff Green, the editor in chief, really wanted to bring me on board. And then right when that happened, Dan Shu, who was running EGM, was like, "Oh, I think I can get you back on EGM. We really, really want you here." And I ended up deciding to go. It was crazy. I actually decided to go to EGM and be a reviews editor. And I sat there editing other people's reviews in the first day, and then I just decided, I'm like, I gotta go over to CGW. It was so awkward, man. Like John Davison, who basically ran all of the Ziff Davis publications at the time, was like, "What are you doing, dude?" And, and it was, I mean, because at the time, I really liked EGM, and I'm like
Sure, yeah.
massively appreciative for what it afforded me, but it was still very much a popular magazine, and they were trying to write for a very, very broad audience and very what I would call shallow and topical approaches to games. A review was really like, here's a couple witticisms, an impression, and then on to the next thing. And it wasn't just word; it was a combination of word count, but also just fear that it was too nerdy to actually engage with the way a game was structured. And as you could tell, like having moved into design, that was really what I was interested in most all along. So yeah, I think I made the right decision there, and I was able to shape Computer Gaming World, and which became Games for Windows magazine, in a way that I'm still proud of. I mean, I think in some way it was kind of like a preview into where writing about games would head in the years since. It's massively improved across the board. I mean, the stuff that's put out now is far, far better. But just the range of topics that we were writing about, and the amount of attention we paid to them, I think we were one of the first in America, at least. I mean, I big props to PC Gamer UK was also doing similar things at the same time. But in America, as far as the print scene went, I thought we were doing a good job.
So I guess that lets me pivot to the reason we're talking in the first place is that you're always kind of interested in design and stuff like that, and sort of like breaking apart the pieces of games. And if people went back and listened to the podcast that you were on, like that was always something you were talking about, like especially when you would talk about playing games like Stalker and stuff like that, especially systemic games
Right.
that have a lot of these separate pieces that come together to allow these sort of varied player experiences. Do you find now that being on the development side, and this leads into Resident Evil because the way you talked about it is differently than the way I talk about it, because I look at some of what I do in my criticism, and and part of that is recommending to people whether it's worth playing and it's worth their money. There's a little bit in that still is a little more of a holistic view of the product, and what you seem to be talking about, and some of the stuff that I would mention in my write Revelations too, but that you were picking apart a little more closely, was finding pieces that really work, that it doesn't matter if the holistically it's a little bit awkward, that you were able to appreciate and really drill into those smaller parts.
Yeah, I think one aspect of being a successful designer is an ability to look at games and atomize them and appreciate what is functioning, take note of what isn't working, and try to understand why that's the case. But it's no longer a matter of trying to pin a score on this game, you don't even really think about that. And I find that when you approach a game and you think ultimately, and I know that you guys no longer attach scores, or you haven't for quite some time,
Right.
Kotaku. I think that's a very important change because you're familiar with the the behavioral psychology notion of priming, where you can, if your mind is set to start thinking of things along certain lines before you engage with it, that pre-existing bias will shape the way that you respond to something. And I think when you jump into something and you're looking to score it, every little point is like, okay, but how does this factor in holistically to the score, you know?
Right.
Whereas when you work with design, and my priming is, maybe there's something awesome in here that I can take and shape in some different way and transform, or like take some component of it and have it inform what I'm doing. Or maybe I see a similar problem that was solved in a different way and I can learn a lesson from it. So there's that. But I also think it's not just something that's peculiar to a developer, and it's not even peculiar to all developers. Plenty of people I work with, I'd say actually the majority of them, still have the same like love it, hate it thing. Like you start a conversation at lunch, that game fucking sucks. And you try to dig in, why? Well, let's talk about it. And there's one thing, right? There's one or two things. But then when you start, talking about the other aspects of it, they're like, okay, I'll give you that. That's kind of cool about it and stuff. So it was something about the way I looked at games all along, and I think I was capable of it even in the press. But it would be like, and maybe this is the reason I'm trying to interrogate myself to figure out why. I think I never had faith in storytelling in games.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I don't believe it belongs there, but I'd never been really, really impressed by it, and I've never had it.
It wasn't the reason that you played games. It's not so much that discounts the notion that they could go that way, or that eventually it could get there, but you weren't necessarily waiting for them to figure it out. So rather than watching designers and storytellers figure that out inch by inch, you seem to gravitate towards like more player experiences or player-driven experiences that are born out of Deus Ex, Dishonored, like these types of games in which storytelling may occur on sort of like the expected narrative level, but it's more the player story and how they choose to play the game that ends up driving like the stories that you tell your friends. Like, here's this fucking cool thing I did, and here's how I did it.
And in that capacity, if there's a formal story that the developers are applying to the game, to what extent is it a reflection of my input as a user, as a participant in the story? And in almost all cases, when you think of narrative games, it's nothing at all. I mean, you think of like, and going back to like the original Metal Gear, how fast you were able to mash the button would determine the fate of a character, right?
Right.
Determine the that sort of thing is irrelevant to me. I mean, it's completely arbitrary, and it wouldn't matter if the coin was simply flipped at that point. But I did appreciate, not saying this just because it's my current employer, but one thing I did appreciate about Dishonored was that the way that the story would change would be reflected incrementally through a character over the course of play and as I was playing. So that would be an example of like, I see promise in that. I like that sort of thing. But anyway, yeah, back to the original point, I think I've always sort of been capable of saying there are parts of this that I like, and I'm okay with the parts that are not functioning as well. And in the case of Resident Evil, I mean, to hop right to it, like in I believe it was your write-up for the second episode, which that's when you sort of had a turn. You were very unimpressed with the first installment. And the second one, you were turning around. But then, like, there was a paragraph that really got me thinking. I was like, and that's when I reached out to you. And you're talking about how these sort of like ridiculous and very video gamey contrivances where, the group is trying to escape the island and they just happen to discover a helicopter. And in that village, there just happens to be fuel for the engine for that helicopter. For you, I don't know the extent to which that pulled you from the experience altogether.
Not so much altogether as much as it's just sort of eye-rolly in a way that felt unnecessary and didn't... Like, I understood that those were essentially just funnels back into the combat experience that are, if we step back a bit, it's probably partially because it's like a lower budget game, right? And so they're like, what they can afford to do is to repackage the combat experiences, and so they feel this necessity to give you a little bit more to do, but they're limited by the scope of the game, and so that kind of stuff got eye-rolly largely because when I was playing it, like, it was clear that the developers, or at least it was to me, the impression was left to me that the narrative was important to them, right? Like part of the reason this is episodic was not just sort of to break up the experience, because they were trying to tell a story in a certain way. And it's just stuff like that was like, okay, like, well, if you just want to do these combat scenarios, I guess let's just get to them. And some of the time that stuff just, it felt like they were putting steps in the way of just getting to the action that I was enjoying in a way that I guess maybe taking out of the experience is one way to put it, but I guess I would also argue I wasn't really there for the experience in the first place, because the first episode, like, kind of, it gave you the impression, like, if you thought this was a narrative game, like, know what you're in for, it's not going to go in that direction. And it was the second episode, because I'd already committed to playing, that I started to see within those constraints, like, the designers starting to do some really interesting things. And within the constraint of this game is going to have co-op, and I think they failed to make it interesting on one end, but then ended up making it completely interesting on the other end, to the point of, I wish the whole game had been about Barry and Natalia, just because I thought that was the one time that they were really successful at making two characters that weren't just palette swaps or another character with equivalent abilities. Like, they really committed to them being different, and I actually enjoyed going between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. What was stood out to me was that with the helicopter example you provided, is that happened to be one of the, perhaps the most grounded fictional element in the entire story.
Right.
And for me, like, in that word grounding is going to be all important. Everything I have to say is that when I look at the history of the franchise, and especially including the most successful entries, Resident Evil 4, they have never been grounded at all. They are just utterly, like, absurd. So, like, if you look at 4, some of the classic examples is that there's, like, an insane midget who lives in a castle, and there's, like, a moat in the bottom of his castle with lava and dragon heads that spew fire at you as you try to cross a path to get a treasure chest. And very much like Zelda, which I want to go back to. Or even, like, to draw from the episodes, the very first level, there's like blades on spinning Iron Maidens.
Yep.
Right. And in what circumstance, like, if you tried to ground that, I can think of no circumstance other than a Batman villain in which you would imagine, or like a Saw movie or something,
right, how
this could happen. And I think most games that do involve fantasy, like BioShock or something, they try to be very, very highly grounded. You're going to walk into a space, and you need to know, why was this space built? For what purpose did it serve? What kind of things happened when it wasn't used for what you're using it for right now, namely to play this game and to go through this level in the shooter. Convince people that it serves some purpose, and that it in peacetime that it made perfect sense. And in Resident Evil, it's really, really never, like, I guess that's why it surprised me. There's kind of like this spectrum, right? Where if, like, on the one end, you've got, let's say, something that aims for hyper-realism, and it wants to explain every single aspect of it in a way that would be satisfactory to someone who is trying to poke holes in it.
Right.
And then on the far end, you've got something like Pac-Man, but, like, something that's representational, like Mario or Zelda, where you're like, if you look at Zelda, which I would say is one step closer to the BioShock side of things than it is to Mario, you have a world where there is a series of dungeons, and they're basically just a maze of challenges designed to test your ability with a single tool that you either need to gain access to that dungeon or that you acquire within that dungeon. And then there's a giant monster sitting in a room locked behind a cage, waiting for you to arrive with the precisely the tool required to destroy it. And that is, like, I think Resident Evil, like, if you regard it, it's much closer to that. And that's one thing about Evil Within that made a lot of sense to me, is that Resident Evil always could have just abandoned that and said, we're not concerned with that. And then, what Evil Within does is say, well, this is all happening in the people's minds, right?
And the kind of dreamscape that it's set in, yeah.
Yeah, so where would you find a room with Iron Maidens that spin around with blades on them? Like, in someone's nightmare. And that makes perfect sense to me.
Right, it allows the conceit to at least make sense. You're in a fantastical setting, but you've created a conceit in which it's at least logical to the player. So it may not be grounded in our own reality, but it's grounded in its own reality.
Right, and that grounding and that reality in game, which is why I appreciate Resident Evil and Zelda, is largely determined by the way that the game is designed. So it's the design logic that becomes the logic of the world. Like when you look at, like, I'm playing Majora's Mask right now, and it's just an insane example from that is that you run into a Goron who's like stuck on a cliff and he's freezing to death, and he tells you he's hungry and he can't come down. And you're like, okay, well, that's interesting. Ultimately, the way you get him down is, what the hell is it? You learn a song. You find out that there's the prince of the Gorons is just distressed and heartbroken and can't sleep, and he's crying incessantly, and that's keeping everyone in his village awake. And it's because he misses his dad. And then you learn some song from his dad, and you take it to the son, and you play half of it on the bongos. The kid remembers the rest. It comforts him, and he goes to bed. When he goes to bed, torches in his chamber light up. Why? Who knows? Because it's video game logic. And the reason they light up is because now that affords you the opportunity to take a stick and light every other torch inside that village. Once you do, there's a giant chandelier that hangs from the ceiling and that begins to spin. Up until then, on the ends of the chandelier, there are these pots, and you could break one of them when it was stationary, but you couldn't hit the other ones. And now that they're spinning, you can go back up to the top where there's a ramp. There's a launch ramp made for Gorons to turn into a ball and roll off the ramp and presumably break the pots on the chandelier that only spin when the torches are lit. And in one of those ceramic containers is a stone piece of meat called like the stone sirloin or something.
Yeah, I remember.
Rock sirloin. And that, you think, okay, well, what's food? Who's hungry? Oh, remember there was that one guy. So you take it back to the guy who's on the ledge. You feed him. It nourishes him. He's happy. He's fine. He's able to return to what he wanted to do. And in return, he gives you a mask that lets you talk to frogs. And what that mask that talks to frogs allows you to do is anybody's guess until about 8 hours later, when similarly you make some connection. And the amazing thing to me about this is it's all utterly absurd. If it's completely ungrounded and it's utterly absurd. As a causal sequence, it doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, when you say you say it out loud, it's. I mean, I played this game recently all the way through. When you say it out loud, it's like, yeah, that's okay, all right, yeah. But I didn't feel that way when I played it, which is ultimately, I guess, probably your point.
Right, and the other part of the point though is, as a causal sequence, it makes no sense, but yet the players, we're able to make the connections and still perform the task in the chain in order to satisfy the mission conditions. And why is that, right? Like that, you would think that, and Majora's might be a bad example here because it was notorious for being the kind of game that required a strategy guide.
Right.
But nonetheless, I think the best cases and the best Zeldas, they're just as random. They're entirely governed by this internal logic of gameplay. But people understand them. And I think the reason they understand them is because they all involve the systems of the game. The game will teach you at some point that you can light torches, and the game will also teach you that you will be rewarded in almost every case when there are torches to be lit. If you light them all, that you'll find some reward.
Right.
And every step in that sequence similarly has been trained in some way so that you understand that in this entirely strange world of Zelda, there are things that you do that make a kind of sense that make no sense in the world that we live in. And for me, long story short, these are games that are driven by design. And when you have a grounded game, the more grounded you are, the more you start to close off design opportunities for yourself. I have to cough 1 second. So, like, when we were making BioShock Infinite,
right?
And you're thinking, what do you mean grounded? It's a city in the sky. It's like this is crazy nonsense. I can think, I'm not going to name them because I don't know if I'm cleared yet, if the NDA is expired, but several gameplay demonstrations, sequences and gameplay vignettes that I constructed that I thought were very, very successful, but that were omitted for one reason or another, almost always because of a grounding issue. It wasn't sufficiently plausible, and it was very designery. And I think, I'm not saying I hate that kind of constraint. Sometimes a constraint, as the bromide goes, it lets you, brings out the best, right? You find a way. Well, I want to achieve this with design. How can I justify this in the context of this world? And sometimes that'll improve clarity in any number of things.
But it sounds like maybe you're saying that sometimes you can take that too far to the degree that maybe the design should bend to, or the grounding or the context should bend to approach the design, so that the two can complement each other, as opposed to, sometimes the restraint works in a way that, like you said, allows clarity, but that if you take that too literally, if you hold yourself to too high of a standard towards that, you're actually perhaps hurting both sides in the process.
Right, I'd say that, and also that I think there's a reason why Zelda, for instance, is so, and some of the more successful Mario games like Galaxy series are so they hold such a special place in people's hearts and memories, and that's because, and my theory is that that's because they understood those games simply through interacting with the design, almost always in a nonverbal way, and I think that kind of interaction is special and memorable. And I think even like Half-Life 2, for example, which I love, I think it's loaded with that sort of thing. If you try to break it down, like if you look at the way that the Combine, all puzzles involving Combine technology, for instance, it's completely absurd. What kind of creature would design, I'm thinking of the tubes that have the energy ball in them, and that you power shields on and off by removing these things. It's really like, if you stop and like ask too much, it's like, it really doesn't matter though, because it's fun. And what's really important is how you're introduced to it and how you start to grasp it. It's like almost any puzzle game. And then you become competent enough with it to see yourself through. And, so back to Resident Evil, I think all of the sections in this, like almost all Resident Evils, they're really just pure design logic. The way that every section is composed, it just is entirely about the design.
And so from your perspective, what would that leads us to a situation where you get to sort of like the weirdly grounded absurdity of, well, we have a helicopter, go find the fuel, and then around the corner just happens to be the fuel, is an instance of the design just sort of dictating sort of an absurd logic, in which they have to ground it in this reality of, well, you have to take this helicopter and fill it up with fuel. So I guess my question to you then is like, so that ended up bothering me. Do you look at that and that bothers you, or it's sort of irrelevant to the point?
Just checking, make sure my mic's not muted.
No, you're good.
Okay. So that part I don't think was especially effective, because I thought that was an attempt at grounding. It was very prosaic. An example of something that wasn't grounded that I thought was successful was in episode 4, I believe, there's like a giant crane type rig.
Yeah.
That's very clearly, it's just purely a cooperative, it's a design puzzle for the case that they have where the player's in control of two different characters, or that there are two people playing and each is in control of a single character. And it requires you to work with those together. That giant rig, whatever it was for, makes absolutely no sense to me. I don't understand why someone would make it, why they would contrive it in such a way that you would have to, that the person sitting on the crane that moves would have to, would be unable to control where that crane goes, and that a second person would have to operate it. And that there are, like, instead of a single control point, there are like 20 control points stretched out across the station that just so happen to be perfectly arranged so that they allow you to sort of leapfrog one character over another.
But I think like so the difference there, and I think it's relative or complements your point about Zelda, is that like it can get away with the absurdity as long as like the player is participatory in the process, and I think that's what's the disconnect is in that moment in episode 2.
Yes,
when you feel like you're just being led along on a string to accomplish something. You're doing what the designer needs you to do, and that often is the case, but it's usually couched in an illusion, or at least an illusion that's participatory, in which the player feels like they've accomplished some sort of goal or solved some sort of puzzle. And those are ways that it seems like designers are able to mask those things, right? Like, we need the player to do this. Okay, well, in order to get them to do this, how can we feel like they're active or an agent in that process? And it seems like in the instance of finding the gas and finding whatever, I think an engine is what you have to find as well. You don't feel like an agent in that. Like, it becomes so transparent that we need to get to B, and to get there, I'm strung along to find this bullshit. Whereas, in Zelda, when you have those instances, like, you feel participatory, and the other instance with the dumb crane puzzle, at least I'm participating, right? Like, the design logic is plain. Like, if you talk about it, and as we're talking about it now, if I wrote it down, it sounds ridiculous, but in the actual playing, I didn't notice it as much, because at least I'm an active agent in the process.
It could be. Let me like flip it with another question for you. What about the sequence in the third episode, where the gating mechanism is that there's a stone statue crucified on a metal door somehow, and that there's an opening where the liver would be or some organs. And ultimately, the solution to this puzzle is to find the pieces of the stone liver so that you can place them in this, place them in the statue, which causes the statue to break and allow you to pass through the door. So I think the moment you see that, having some sort of game literacy from having played any previous Resident Evil, you know immediately, okay, this is a multi-part key. This is a lock that requires multiple keys, and the keys are going to be in the shape of pieces of stone liver.
Right.
And so at that moment, you realize what the gig is. You're like, I want to go through this door. Now I have to go find some things. In the same way that when you go to the helicopter and it has no fuel or no engine, you're like, okay, now I need to go find gas and I need to find. But inarguably, a stone liver that's broken into multiple components. And one of those components, for instance, is encased in a pig rendering plant, and the way that you extract it is by dumping pig blood.
It's one of my favorite bits
into the machine.
In the whole game.
So, right, and you like that, right? And what's the difference when you saw this, which is it's just far more contrived?
Yeah,
it makes no sense whatsoever. It would be, and that one in particular really made me think. Okay, Mikami is onto something with Evil Within, and that like by taking this away from any kind of real world grounding and letting it happen like in this Jacob's ladder space of the mind. But so why was it that when you did all that you didn't have the same response?
Well, I think there could be a couple explanations. One is that if you're familiar with the franchise, like you said, you sort of like, oh, this could just be a sort of generic callback to the absurd. Like, it's possible. I don't know if it's necessarily true, but you could immediately interpret it as it's the designers poking fun at like old design philosophy that was certainly a part of the original Resident Evil, in which you're running around a mansion and finding all these dumb emblems and putting them in the doors for like absolutely like no logical reason, and that you just accepted because the game was revolutionary for all sorts of other aspects, and you just kind of went along for the ride. And so I think you can look at that and go, if you're a fan of the series, that's almost kind of entertaining, right? Like, so yes, it's sort of absurd. Yes, it's really no different than the finding the pieces for the helicopter. But if Resident Evil is already couched in the absurd, and this is a callback to something that's already done, I don't know if it's forgivable. If like we start, when I start talking about it this way, it's like, no, it is the same thing. But it didn't bother me because it felt like it was the game poking fun at itself. And sort of saying, yes, we know this is all kind of goofy, ha ha ha, like go find the two pieces. And I didn't really think anything of it. And
it's impossible to know. This is why I love Japanese games.
Right.
For me, it's impossible to know when they're being ironic and when they aren't. Like, not always, right? Like when a cutscene starts off with the character screaming like "Holy Mother of Balls,"
right?
I understand that they're being ironic. But when I run into that puzzle sequence, I really don't know.
Like, yeah,
and in a way, it's ingenious,
Do they just think, like, this is what we wanted to do? Or is it a commentary on the original Resident Evil design, in which if it's not, then I'm just applying that as a player and interpreting it that way, and then applying a layer of intention that was never there in the first place. But and then it becomes a fun thought conversation. But if I don't consider it, doesn't really matter. And that's, its own weird rabbit hole.
And so, the other point, similarly, I think that the game is really driven by the combination of combat and puzzles. Obviously, it moves from a combat puzzle to a non-combat puzzle and back and forth. And that is when I think about the longevity of the Resident Evil franchise, or at least for me, why I like it, it's that at least from a certain point on, it started doing really good things with it. It's utterly simple, but it's elegant, right? Like when you look at that, the weapons are far less exotic in Revelations 2 than they are in 4, for example. There's nothing like the mine thrower, where there's just that tremendous satisfaction of hitting someone with something, and then there's that delay where that they're basically going to explode. They can take out other guys. That feature was so cool that the Gears of War team obviously adapted it for the torque bow, but there's nothing like that. It's just all very standard. But the ability, they look at like what's the tool set that we give our players. They can switch back and forth between two characters. These characters have asymmetrical abilities. How can we maximize sort of the challenge and the number of iterations of gameplay sequences when this is really all we're dealing with? And so they're like I said, they're dealing with very little, and yet they manage to consistently create challenges that utilize and leverage the systems that they build. So I completely appreciate that. Another example, I think you pointed this out too, is a very ingenious AI where it's like the thing is encased in organic armor, and there's a weak spot hidden somewhere. It might be the left leg or the right thigh or the right arm or the head. And only by switching to the secondary character that has a supernatural vision ability can you determine where that is. And since this game is entirely predicated on resource scarcity, and every wasted shot is significant, it's in your interest to find out where that weak point is. So one, that you make the combat easier for yourself, but so that you minimize resource expenditure. It's from a design point of view, it's hard not to appreciate that. And I think that Resident Evil games, as it pertains to AI, they've always been inspired, at least in one part or another. I think the blind Gerudos in Resident Evil 4 are favored among almost all systems designers. They're the guys that they can't see, but they attack you based on hearing, and they put things in the environment that create noises and distraction, but then they start to pair those with other AIs that can see you. And of course, in dealing, presents you with this dilemma. Do I attack the guys that can see me? But then at that point, I've alerted the blind and extremely lethal AI to my position. So I need to reposition and move to even the regenerators in Resident Evil 4, which is pretty much the prototype for the guys I just described with the organic armors, that there's a weak point hidden somewhere within them, and the only way to see it is with thermal imaging attached to a sniper scope. And if you don't hit that, they'll continue to regenerate. Stuff like that, I think, really, really makes the game work. And I think there was a fair amount of that in Revelations, enough that I was satisfied with it.
Yeah, I mean, like some of the best sequences in the game are, and I obviously preferred the stuff with Barry and Natalia just because I thought their skill sets, their individual powers complement each other in a way. Yes. And the first time you encounter the invisible enemies in Revelations 2, there's probably two sequences that are my favorite two sequences of the game. We can talk about them separately because I have to imagine they were favorites of yours as well. The first is when you encounter the invisible enemies, and in which the game presents you with two ways to deal with them, especially if you're playing by yourself, is that you can sort of rely on the unreliable narrator of Natalia pointing out and saying, like, look left, like, look right, and shoot. And I think that stuff works, like, fairly well. But what I found to be the most distressing, but also the most useful, was, like, switching to the other character. And then you're able to control her, see where the enemy is moving in the environment. And they're not moving fast, they're moving slow. So it's like a very slow amount of stress that is building up over time, as opposed to having to deal with any sort of speedy enemy. But the moment you switch back to Barry to actually take the shot, yes, you have a more accurate picture of where the enemy is, but by the very necessity of swapping back to the character, you're, a half a second behind. And so as you line up that shot and take it, like when you would miss, like it felt way worse, but it was also incredibly satisfying when you did connect those shots and then hammered down on the right trigger, and then that enemy went down.
It's like being on a mortar crew, right? Where you've got a spotter, then you've got the person that's dialing in, and you have to correct that shot in order to make it hit. And what they do when they introduce it is you not only you are very in close physical proximity to not Claire. What's her name again?
Natalia.
Natalia. So you're right next to Natalia, so that when you do shift between her viewpoint and yours, the perspective change is very minimal, and the time change, as you pointed out, is minimal as well. And then once they teach you the basics, then they start to put you in situations where Natalia and Barry are physically separated by a much greater degree, so that both the perspective difference and the time difference are amplified, so that eventually what happens is you're up on a ledge with Natalia and you see, okay, it's over here, but you need to mark some landmark and say, okay, it's right over by this rock or this piece of rebar. And then you switch positions, and now you're in an entirely different position, removed by like 30 feet or so with Barry, and you're much lower. And then the time it might have moved a little bit. and you have to say, okay, like I'm going to guess it's going to be right here, right about now, and hit it. And that's a very natural escalation of the challenge that they introduced early on. It's very Mario-like, really.
Yeah, and they start stacking that stuff because you know Natalia's powers are introduced as just giving you sort of a heads up of the 4 enemies that are around the corner, and it's useful, but it's not that useful. Like you can Barry is fairly overpowered. He has a ton of like really generous weapons, so he can kind of hold his own in a way that you don't need to use that. But then what I thought was so effective was that they find a way where, well, I guess you could spray your bullets as Barry, but that's a great way to, in a resource-starved game to lose all your stuff. And so you have to use Natalia in a way that, when you play as Claire and Moira, like, yes, is it useful to have her take her flashlight out and stun the enemy? But I never found that the game ever outright prevented me from progressing within any sort of enemy type that required that, as opposed to Barry and Natalia, in which I like outright needed to use the 2 characters in order to progress. And the sequence I think you might be talking about is like the one where Barry they're in like the sewer section, and he's on the ground and Natalia's up above, and she's opening all these gates so that he can get through. Yes. And it's the first time where they finally actually start putting Natalia in danger in a way that she can't protect herself, so that you have to use Natalia to sort of like wake up an enemy and then swap over to Barry and hopefully have given Natalia enough distance that you can pull off the headshot. And because often you're kind of fighting those enemies at a distance. And I found those to be like just the most satisfying. Like as the player, I felt, as a game, the game was relatively easy, all things considered. But even in those moments that weren't all that difficult, I felt like I was juggling a lot of things in an incredibly satisfying way.
Yeah, and that scene right there is just another development. It's an improvement on something that they introduced. Like when you think in Resident Evil 4 and the scenes where, God, I forget all their names. Like I said, I don't pay attention to the story, but the president's daughter is up in the upper section.
Ashley, I want to say.
Ashley is up on the upper section inside the castle, and you're down, and you have to snipe the guys, otherwise they'll grab her and they'll try to take her off scene, and you got to continue to shoot them. But this is much more symbiotic, where Natalia is able to pinpoint where the threats to Barry are, and then Barry has to take out the threats that are directly going after Natalia. So I think that in that sense, it's a definite improvement. Something about this though is that it's a single solution set of problems, right? Like it's an approach where, and Zelda is often very much like this, right? Like like you go into a dungeon in Zelda, and you need to use the hook shot, and you have to have the arrow, and you have to have like the iron boots or something.
Right.
All 3 of those, and you know that you need to use each of those basically when the design dictates it. Another approach to games, which is like what we do with Arkane and Dishonored, is that you have a whole number of tools, and you can use them in any way you see fit. It's not like this puzzle is specifically made so that the only way to solve it is by using blink in conjunction with like possession or something.
Right.
We have to account for, in Dishonored, they could account for everyone had blink, but there might, you can't have any kind of hard gate that involves possession because, you don't know what % of players actually have invested in that. And it's different. I don't think one's better than the other. I think they're entirely different ways to do things. But one consequence of, one benefit of doing things the Arkane way is that you end up owning the solution in a way you can't in Resident Evil Revelations. In that Barry and Natalia sequence, I guarantee that you and I played in almost exactly the same way.
Yeah, that's probably true.
But it felt great though because in non-explicitly nudged us into the same solution, and the solution felt satisfying. And then even though once we understood how to solve the puzzle, actually implementing that solution felt satisfying. Whereas you get an entirely different sort of satisfaction in a game where you were devising the solution on your own. But for the thing that I will say about, because I don't, without singing the praises of our own approach, the thing that I like about these kind of games like Resident Evil and Zelda is that it does allow designers to create very specific sequences, and they know that they can start to teach you and nudge you in the direction of the solutions that they have in mind, that feels much more streamlined and elegant than something like where it's much wider open, and we're not trying to privilege one approach over another. We're trying to allow for them all to be valid in some way. But as long as the way in which they are validated is experientially different, right? So that like if I took one approach, the way that I played was entirely different from yours. It might have been like easier for me up front and harder at the end, whereas you might have had to spend a whole bunch of work at the beginning of that sequence, and then it was easy later on. I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and that's not something that Resident Evil, this version. I think RE4 probably gives you a little more agency in regards to kind of employing different strategies, partially because of the amount of items and weapons you have at your disposal, and also because the environments are much bigger in a lot of instances. But in Revelations 2, I never found that. In the instances where you actually found yourself like in big open environments, like it was often against like a boss type enemy, right? In which like you're essentially just dealing with a bullet sponge. And so I never found it, sort of problematic or anything that bothered me, but you do have these guided instances in which the designers are funneling you towards essentially the same solution for every player. But then there is never that instance in which they really allow you to start branching off and like, okay, here's the sequence, and then to use what you'd like to. I mean, I think the bosses are really the closest they get to that. But one of the things I liked about The Evil Within, that it did it sometimes, not nearly as much as I would have liked, but it's when you get those big open sequences where the game steps away and says, okay, you've got like 15 techniques that you could use to employ to kind of take out these 6-7 guys that are scattered throughout this world. Go do it yourself. We've given you the tools. And there's an early sequence in Evil Within that is extremely similar to the village sequence that opens RE4, right, that like it's just as effective. It's maybe not as memorable because it's Mikami kind of doing it a second time, but it was probably my favorite sequence in the whole game, even if it was as early as it was, because I just felt like I was improvising in a way that that in Revelations 2 they don't really allow that. But I think it's fine. Like the improvisation is a little bit limited, but I don't think it makes it any less satisfying, even if it's not one of those games that allows you to sort of kind of pull from a huge bag of tricks.
Right. It is interesting. Just you made me think of when I was continually referring to elements in Revelations 2 as being reworkings and adaptations of things that originated in previous Resident Evils, and then when you bring up Evil Within, it's really the same thing. I mean, so much of Evil Within really strikes me as here's another attempt to take things that we implemented at some point in the past and improve on those, and that's it's an interesting facet of the Resident Evil series for me. It's always very familiar, right? I mean, if you've been playing them consistently, there's always the sense that like, oh, I know this. What's the twist on it going to be this time? In a way, it's kind of like, I don't know. I think of like, well, what's a good comparison would be like maybe comic books, like superhero comic books, where they're just telling the same stories over and over again, but it's really just about, well, what's the twist that we're going to add to it this time? How are we going to improve the story that's probably in the 60-year history of this character that's probably been told 50 times already?
It's just a remix.
How are we going to remix it in such a way? But yeah, I think that's good. Like that's a good word for it. Like almost every Resident Evil and Evil Within included, which I see as kind of like a new Resident Evil series, they're really just remixes on things that they've been doing, and each one will introduce something new, and then the next one will remix on that. But every one of them has very much got the DNA of its forebears in it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, especially if you sort of look at the legacy of Mikami when he was working on those franchises. That the ones in which he would go really outside of the remix, those just became new franchises, right? Like Resident Evil 4 became Devil May Cry because he experimented with a more sort of action-oriented version, and the ones that actually ended up shipping with the Resident Evil branding then just became explicitly a little more on the remix side, which I think is sort of interesting insofar as how you handle that stuff. And I wonder how much that is the designers, how much of that is sort of the business end, or how much of that is how they feel comfortable with sort of tampering with a formula that has worked before.
Yeah, I don't know, but there's something else that, like, when you think of comic books, what you have are largely people who've been influenced by the comics that they read growing up and that were super fans, and that they end up writing and illustrating comics, and they kind of want to return to what they know and give their own stamp on it. I mean, I wonder to what extent Resident Evil games are like that. Like I really don't know. I don't know. Is it the same set of designers that's been there all along, or is there a constant influx of new talent? And it's kind of that same situation where they're like, oh, I grew up reading Batman, I grew up playing Resident Evil, and I've always loved this about it. And they have their experiences playing Resident Evil in their mind, and they kind of just want to iterate on on those same sets of experiences? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that's probably a good stopping point because it's a question we could revisit another time. We should do this again some other time. This was a lot of fun.
I'd love to. I mean, the natural place to dovetail this in was in the beginning when you were talking about my past in the press. But the thing that I miss more than anything is just being able to talk like this in a podcast about games. Because, I mean, I clearly I like thinking about games and talking about games, but just don't have that outlet. So it is a great pleasure and an opportunity I appreciate.
All right, well, Shawn, I appreciate your time doing this, and if folks enjoy it, let us know, and we'll try and do it again sometime soon.